We all know Hayao Miyazaki is a master filmmaker, but it can be hard to pinpoint exactly why he's so good. Which actually makes sense. His movies are so active in their fantasy, in the creation of complex realities and characters, that they feel totally separate from regular categories of cinema or anime. There's a lot to talk about with his films, but what I'm interested in here is how Miyazaki uses space. Not only the space of his environment, the dynamic movement of his characters, or his complex editing schemes, but I'm also talking about the metaphysical space, which Miyazaki is always reaching towards. Miyazaki is truly a cosmological filmmaker. He's constantly taking inferences from the larger arenas of our world. The forest, the sky, the heavens, and relating those enormous spaces to the lives and struggles of individuals living in complex societies. Miyazaki's films take personal quests and put them in the context of the world's lifeblood and the state of the spiritual universe. We're going to primarily look at two of his films, Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away. Not just because they're great films, but because they have a deep continuity between them. In fact, I think you can really look at Spirited Away as a kind of far future sequel to Princess Mononoke. And yet at the same time, these films have almost polar opposite ways of presenting space. You can see this relationship just by comparing their opening shots. Princess Mononoke begins with an enormous pan down from the mountains to the forest floor being crushed away. It's an origin story of environmental annihilation and the loss of the sacred world. In Spirited Away's opening, we see the end result. Suburbs now cover the hills and landscape. Trapped inside her family's moving car, the natural world is practically fading away into Chihiro's hands. And whereas Princess Mononoke takes place at the very twilight of humans living alongside the spirits, in Spirited Away, the spiritual world has been totally cut off and isolated from our own.
Hang on, almost there.
If you want to get conspiratorial, the tree in the realm of the forest spirit and the tree at the entrance to the supposed shortcut in Spirited Away are markedly similar. But no matter what level of shared worlds there are between the films, together they tell an enormous story about the formation of how our world looks, feels, and connects to the beyond. Now, Miyazaki is known for using a lot of flight in his films, but Princess Mononoke is actually his only movie where nobody flies, which is interesting because so much of it has to do with elevation. Characters jump, fall, shoot arrows really high up, all as a way of expressing this enormous conflict between the advance of human civilization and the spiritual world. In fact, on some level, this whole movie is basically a battle over vertical space. Going back to that very first shot, we can see how Miyazaki is establishing this enormous space from the mountains going down to the boar demon. We then switch to the human side with Ashitaka, also in the forest, traveling upwards, in a direct counterbalance to the opening. This continues as Ashitaka heads up in a steady incline towards the watchtower, building tension for the upcoming battle. Once we get to the watchtower, the elevation becomes extreme. And very quickly, we are back above the mountains again, except on the human side. So within the first 3 minutes of the film, we've already delineated the story's major conflict between the space of the gods and the rising forces of the humans as they overtake the mountains. So of course, when Nago comes out of the forest, he flies upwards and then knocks the tower down, in the first of many Y-axis confrontations. This battle over vertical space becomes both a symbolic and visual key signature for the film. Not only do we see characters scurrying up and down mountains throughout the whole movie, we also see the extreme vertical space in all the major battles. First with Nago and Ashitaka, then on the mountains, then with San versus Irontown, then with the boars versus the humans, Eboshi versus the forest spirit, and later, of course, all throughout the finale, which has as its climax a literal race to the top of the mountain. In these 4 shots, you can see how the major actors of the film's conflict are placed directly at the precipice between the earth and sky, in a way existentially resigned to their roles in this all-consuming war. While enormous verticals are fairly common with Miyazaki, they're not always used in the same way. Compare Mononoke to the first shots of the bathhouse in Spirited Away, where the size of the building is intentionally obscured. Notice how you don't actually see the bottom of the bathhouse. As we'll explore later, this obfuscation of space is one of the core thematics of the film. Now, use of vertical space in cinema is one of the most common ways to show power dynamics. That's nothing new. But this is really crucial here because for Miyazaki, the sky is one of the fundamental dualities in all his films. In one sense, the sky is the site of possibility, imagination, and spirituality. It is, quite literally, the edge of the beyond. But paradoxically, it's also the central site of human warfare and destruction. And that's why you can see his last film, The Wind Rises, not as problematic, but in fact confrontational to the core of his work. In many ways, Princess Mononoke is a kind of prelude to the air battles in his other films. As the spirit forces gaze down on their world crumbling beneath them, the humans fight to gain elevation, build their own mountains of steel and fire, and ultimately sever the link between their world and the sacred one. The sky space that was once ruled by the Night Walker will now become the new battleground for power and domination. The film's apocalyptic final act is filled with images of aerial bombardment, along with an atomic coup de grace, which we can see as a portent of the type of warfare to come. The brilliance of Miyazaki is that during this battle of elevation between the material and spiritual planes, he's running a totally perpendicular operation at the same time. This is through Ashitaka, who is not so much a fully blown character as an axis. In fact, many shots with Ashitaka emphasize the x-axis, really putting him as the force of balance between the film's multi-layered vertical conflicts. Ashitaka is not only between these forces symbolically, he's also physically placed between them. Here he is sweeping between demonic Nago and the young girls. Here he sits between his forefathers and a huge boulder, which bursts into the meeting room just as the ball of metal ore has burst into the Amishi people's way of life. Just as he enters the story as an outsider, Ashitaka is constantly entering the frame of a conflict or action that's already underway. And not always successfully. Sometimes the frame even smothers him. Miyazaki also stacks up the pressure against Ashitaka, often multiplying the elements he has put between. In the Battle at Irontown, you can see how Miyazaki steadily increases the pressure and obstacles on Ashitaka. Before the action even starts, Ashitaka stops briefly at an X-shaped intersection, just to pause and think, literally at a crossroads. Then San shows up. He throws a beam to stop the mob. Then he gets punctured. Then he gets between both San and Eboshi. You can see how this fight was actually foreshadowed by the intersection from before. In these very tight shots at the end, Ashitaka bleeds out as he forces the enormous gate open, all while carrying San with the whole village at his back. The subtlety of this bilateral pressure against Ashitaka even extends to both San and Eboshi, swiping him under his left eye. Ashitaka's body is a pressure gauge for the film's dynamic forces, multiplied by the curse which is both empowering him and destroying him from within. But anyone who watches this film knows that the meaning of its space goes far beyond Ashitaka, the major characters, or even the natural world per se. There's something much bigger going on, and has a lot to do with the film's spiritual side. Many of the humans in the film mistake the forest spirit as a locus of power in the forest. But the forest spirit is not God the creator. It's more of a kind of channel, an energetic medium for the spiritual world. As I mentioned before, the spiritual beyond for Miyazaki is often located in the sky, and throughout the film you can see a constant gaze upwards towards the moon and the sun. The moon and the sun are what control the forest spirit's forms, with the forest spirit acting as an earthly pendulum, an umbilical cord, whatever you want to call it, for the beyond. The split between the human world and the sacred one doesn't occur as the destruction of the forest itself, which is a very westernized view, but as the conquest, both physical and ideological, of that space between us and the sky. That conquest is encapsulated in this shot here, with the forest spirit no longer connected to the heavens. Compare that with a very similar setup in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the gaze upwards from the monolith to the sun also gestures towards spirituality, civilization, and violence. In Space Odyssey, the beyond is always just that, beyond the frame of the film. In Princess Mononoke, the forest spirit itself is beyond our frame of normative understanding. It is material and ethereal, alien and familiar. The forest spirit is androgynous, humorous, serious, and most important of all, silent. What's most interesting, however, is that the forest spirit has a foil character in the material world. The Emperor, who's quite literally outside of the film's frame.
We've got a letter of pardon from the Emperor, forgiving us for cutting off the head of the great forest spirit.
The Emperor, who would have been considered a deity at the time, is a kind of anti-god to the forest spirit's balancing of life and death. It is the Emperor's quest for immortality, and of course the industry of empire, that leads to the gestation of the demonic curse. This means that the Emperor, alongside the forest spirit, are actually the two driving forces of the story. And I think that's what makes this film so immense. On the one hand, we have a spiritual world which exists at the edge of human understanding, and then on the other, we have an imperial human authority whose logic of greed and destruction is, in many ways, just as confounding. As an overview, you can see how the film's various characters are locked into an extremely complex battle over vertical and spiritual space. Ashitaka comes in as a mediating force in the middle, but he's still somewhat lost between an older way of life and the impending approach of civilization. The actual story of the film takes place in the circle, right at the edge of which are the forest spirit and the Emperor. Beyond them, on one end, is the greater spiritual beyond, and on the other, we have the unholy forces of capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, and industrial warfare. Princess Mononoke ends with two new elements: a pacified forest and a surge of totalizing chaos. These 2 points become the primary syntax of Spirited Away. The film is more or less composed of sequences that oscillate between tranquility and chaos, as Miyazaki plays with the materialities of excess and absence. We see this first in the market sequence. The market starts out as a ghost town. Then, as Chihiro's parents begin to gorge on food, the sun quickly sets, and suddenly the world begins to turn into a complete mess. Chihiro finds solace only when she later meets Haku in the calm of the shadows. In the water spirit sequence, Chihiro and Lin clean the room, only to have it turn into a mass of garbage. Then, at the peak of this chaos, Chihiro is swept out of the bathhouse into a palpable alternate reality of total calmness. As Haku arrives at the bathhouse, what first starts as a tranquil tableau soon switches into a violent attack. Then, almost as quickly as it starts, The attack is off, and the assailants turn out to be a cloud of paper. And of course, during the enormous no-face sequence, we start from an empty bathhouse before slowly proceeding once again into absolute chaos. The sequence also features this emblematic scene where tranquility and chaos are layered directly on top of each other, with Chihiro attempting to pacify No-Face, surrounded by a collage of total fallout. Just as No-Face's psychotic rampage peaks, we revert back to utter calmness. This arc between calm and chaos is characteristic of many action sequences in film. And we certainly see lots of it in Miyazaki's work. But this dynamic has a much deeper meaning in Spirited Away. The simplistic plot device of Chihiro rescuing her parents turns out to be a red herring. The real story of the film is the reconciliation of the fact that the mild-mannered, seemingly placid suburbs which Chihiro and her family are moving to are the exact source of the chaos and excess which originally displaced Haku's home river. This film is all about the disorder that lurks below the surface of modern life. There's an obvious mania here that resembles the psychedelic instability of Alice in Wonderland. Or the chaotic mechanization of The Sorcerer's Apprentice and Fantasia. But in terms of developing an otherworldly cinematic space, this film is much more similar to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Like The Shining, the world of the bathhouse is a kind of labyrinth of meaning and confusion. The Shining functions by a simple but powerful rule, where the space and logic of the building constantly transform and dislocate us further from understanding what's truly going on. Even up to the last shot in The Shining, the more that is revealed to us about the nature of the hotel, the less certain we are of how or why it functions. Likewise in Spirited Away, the more that the world is revealed to us, the less it makes sense. Even as the marketplace brightens up with lights, its shadows darken, and the ghosts stay shapeless and silent. When Chihiro runs back towards the clock building, what was once a dry riverbed is revealed to be an enormous black lake. The space is further mystified by the clock building, now miles away, lit up as a nameless town of ghosts. As a boat reveals itself in the water, Chihiro herself begins to disappear. And as more of the bathhouse is revealed to us, Chihiro is yanked around, never able to truly cohere any of its space. The full height of the bathhouse is only revealed to us when Haku and Chihiro fall into the enormous inferno-like interior, further confounding the actual architecture of the building. One of the best and subtlest examples of the film revealing and confounding space is how during the whole second act, the rain pouring outside is steadily building up to become, as we learn along with Chihiro, an enormous ocean. More of the world is revealed to us, but what's revealed turns out to be an unascertainable void. Compare that to Monsters, Inc., another 2001 film with a remarkably similar premise, in which we explore the labor practices of a parallel spiritual enclave. Here, everything is revealed all at once. It's a great film, but there's a brightness to each image which prevents it from coming off as ethereal or foreboding. In the disorder of Spirited Away, everything is subject to change. In the span of the water spirit sequence, the space undergoes 6 distinct transformations. As a kind of combination between the madness of the machine world in Chaplin's modern times and the spiritual psychosis of Unlucky Jack in The Shining, the bathhouse exerts a dislocating mania on its inhabitants. The chaos of the bathhouse occurs not just in its physical realms, but penetrates the psyches of the film's characters, who all collectively lose the ability to recognize each other and themselves.
I know that voice.
Here, I'll pay you up front. And I want to take a bath, too.
You see this with Chihiro and her parents,
Which ones are you? Mom!
Chihiro and Haku in his dragon form,
Hold still. Those paper things are gone now. You're going to be all right.
Yubaba's sister,
Can't you even tell me from your own mother?
Yubaba's baby, the water spirit, and of course No Face and its charade of voices. Not only does Chihiro become Sen in the film, by association, we can assume that many, if not all, of the bathhouse workers have lost their identities as well. On a deeper level, the bathhouse has misrecognized its own purpose, turning what was once sacred healing water into a virtual commodity. As in The Shining, getting out of this labyrinth means we need to begin a total reversal. The final act of the film is then an undoing of all the previous elemental layers, beginning, of course, with No Face's climactic deflation. Then we flip the bathhouse's vertical jaunts by going on a horizontal journey through the desert of ocean. Then the indentured servitude of the bathhouse is turned over by an idyllic house in the forest. Yubaba is inversed by her non-evil twin, who provides real friendship rather than despotic authority. Labor here is performed not through exploitation, but by joy and fascination. Then Chihiro and Haku are, for the very first time, allowed to move freely. But here, in the real climax of the film, there's still more to be undone. Chihiro finally recognizes Haku's true form, and by renewing this bond between the spiritual world and the human one, she breaks his curse. The undoing of a curse is a theme in nearly all of Miyazaki's films. There's no practical logic to what a curse is exactly, and yet these curses, whether they are cancerous, ancestral, or bodily dysmorphic, shape the curvature of our world. They unite together an animistic environment, the vicissitudes of civilization, and the struggle of individuals. The irony of Spirited Away is that for all its layer-cake chaos, the undoing of the curse is really quite simple. So simple that at times all it takes is a downward motion. In this scene, the liberation of Haku and Chihiro meets with the undoing of the phantom tower of the bathhouse, reversing this whole grand gesture upwards that's taken an epoch of war to build.